Renette, so great to see you. And I first off want to thank you for being the first ever guest. I know you're a podcast host too, but guest with In the Lab and Amaze Media Labs. And you're someone that, as you know, I've admired a long time. We've known each other for quite a bit now. And I wanted to start and I wanted to ask you, originally, when you looked at your company, which I've learned a lot about and really is incredible in the things you're doing, as a CMO of, a major, public company, what was the impetus for you initially to look towards podcasting as something that could build brand or brand narrative? What were your thoughts around starting a podcast?
Can I tell you a funny story?
Oh, you can always tell me a funny story and tell our audience a funny story.
So when I was interviewing with Velo3D, my final stage was actually having to give a presentation to about 9 people, including board members. And part of the presentation was like, what would be your go-to-market strategy and the tactics you would use? And one of the first things I wrote, like this was a year before we started Laser Focus, was start a podcast. And it was because I wanted to make sure that we were telling the story in a way that wasn't sales pitchy. Right? Like, and the community that we serve are like really innovative engineers. And I don't think they want to be sold to. They want to sort of resonate with people in the field and hear about other people and what they're doing and just feel like they can be inspired and share this, like hear about and how these entrepreneurs and these innovators got through that, tough stage. And even like as they start to launch their products and rockets into space, what they're learning. So I thought, when you reached out to me, I was like, oh my God, this is definitely the right time. And just story. And it just sort of connected all the dots.
It's so funny. You never told me that story. And I love it. And it's incredible. And I remember talking to you initially. You had some great ideas. We obviously talked and then discussed we would come together and really put some ideation behind it and show format. But the one thing that I was impressed with the most, and I remember you were a bit nervous and you could never tell now listening to any of your podcasts because you sound like the most relaxed interviewer I know, but you had a little, nerves, I guess, about being a podcast host. And how did you overcome that? And what were, some of the things you worked on, and have you become much more comfortable?
Yeah, well, I actually have to thank you for sort of encouraging me to be the host. So, but I think I took it on because I really wanted a challenge. And I think even at a CMO level, you still want to continue to grow. So I said, okay, I can do this. And it's a very technical audience. And that was, I think, my biggest fear, like being a marketing person, not very technical, talking to very smart engineers with PhDs, was I going to be able to carry the conversation? So I think I remember doing, for every guest, a lot of research. A lot of research about them, about their company, about the product. And so when I got to speak with them, it felt a lot more natural. Like I felt like I knew them. I knew what their struggles were or what they were working on, what their vision and mission was. So I could have a conversation with them rather than feeling like I was constantly searching for the next question.
I love that because I do think, in terms of podcasting, obviously the more research you can do, the better, especially, when you're bringing on these people and feel prepared. But now when I listen to you and kind of, I just see the changes and more of your real personality comes out, which is incredible. And, the thing I want to ask you, when you were thinking about this podcast, at least I was, your company, well known in its industry, doing incredible things, which I had no idea about, but have learned a lot. And I was thinking, okay, a 3D printing company, but you really, I think that was the key, maybe, showing people, not only the technical people, the engineers listening, but showing people what your company is all about, because you really make innovation and I guess, the impossible possible. And was that your thinking too, that we should really be sharing these stories of what we're actually doing?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because like you said, like people don't really see the potential with what metal 3D printing allows. I think if you're an engineer, you do, but people outside, they don't, right? And it's like that's the story we wanted to share and get more people interested in Velo 3D and what we're capable of doing. And then also people who are engineers to think about, okay, if we're enabling rockets into space, what can I potentially do, as an engineer? Like maybe this product I've been working on, I can now find a solution to parts I need. Right. So it was about sort of sharing our story and what our customers are doing in the innovation they're doing, but also inspiring new people to do, new innovations and create new products.
Yeah, it was incredible because listening and thinking and, I'm not the producer, but working with our producers and going over the show formats and us assisting there, I remember listening to like one of the early episodes and talking about space and rockets and I was like, whoa, like that's actually, extremely interesting. And I had no idea your company was doing that and was behind that. And I think, have you found by being able to bring on certain guests, talk to them, that you're able to share those stories, but in an authentic way?
100%, 100%. Like I said, like we didn't want to be a sales pitch. We just wanted to sort of highlight what our customers were doing, make them the heroes, and sort of by, in the background, okay, and Velo 3D is enabling this innovation and these products and these amazing, cool moments, right? Like one of our brand is like awe, right? Like when people see the parts that we print is like, wow, right? And we wanted to do that on the podcast, right? Sort of just like extend our brand through stories from our customers. And not everybody on our podcast has been a customer. They've been somebody in the industry, a customer. So we also wanted to share stories and say, okay, like just they can be related back to Velo 3D. So it's a good mix. But yeah, definitely tell the story of Velo 3D without being a sales pitch and more in an authentic way, hear from the voice of the customer. And I've never asked them to pitch, right? I've never asked them to sort of validate what they're doing with Velo 3D. But there's been a few guests on the show that say, I couldn't do this without Velo 3D. And thank you for helping us build this product. So that's been
And that's what's incredible, I think, about a podcast and actually a good host, because I know from our own personal conversations and feedback that you have definitely received. You're very easy to talk to, and you allow the person you're interviewing to speak and to share. And you're not kind of, especially with any branded podcast, but you're not going in there trying to get specific answers. And I think, and I'm sure, and I wonder if you would agree, because of the way you do that, that it does come out naturally and authentic, and people are much more likely to talk about how Velo 3D really works with them and helps them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I never sort of, when we're putting the questions together, sort of think about how can we get a testimonial out of this customer.
Right.
It's like tell us your story. How did you start this company? Or 10 years into your career, what are you still learning and what could you do better? And what would you tell your younger self? Those sort of questions people love, right? Like I've had so many people reach out to me and say, that was one of the best comments I've ever heard, or the best, like, I love this question. So, yeah, to answer your question, it's definitely about hearing their story, nothing about Velo 3D. It's not a Velo 3D podcast. It's really like a laser focused podcast, presented by Velo 3D with some really cool customers. And that's how we position it.
Yeah, and I love how you did that. And obviously, we work with tons of companies and brands, and we create all different types of podcasts. Some for internal audiences, just for their company. Others, like yours, for external audiences. And I think one of the biggest things I've noticed from companies is, and you just said it, how people come to you and say, that was an incredible conversation. Would you say that the thought leadership, putting yourself out there, has been really helpful for the company?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had people reach out to me and say, can we have our CEO on your podcast? Right? It's kind of compliment, right? So like they see that their CEO should have time to be on our podcast, right? Like that's been awesome, right? It shows that we're thought leaders, that they also want their CEO to have that exposure that we're building, tell their story. So yeah, that's been awesome.
From what you had put in your pitch, the story you shared with us at the beginning, that when you were interviewing for this, chief marketing officer job, which is a big job, obviously, at an incredible company, public, growing. From what you had written and put in there, has that transpired? Has it been similar to what you thought it would be when you wrote that up?
We did pick a little bit from the start of this podcast, and I think that's something anyone thinking about, launching a podcast, it's okay to pivot. So when we first thought about it, we were thinking, when I first pitched, it was going to be to engineers, buy an engineer from Velo 3D, do the technical story, answer technical questions, talk about design. And then as we started rolling out the podcast, we really thought it should be a different sort of angle, a more human interest story and a more broad appeal, especially as we're a public company, right? We want people all over the world and, to understand what we're doing and who we are through our customers, and we're doing really cool things. So it did change completely. And I'm glad it did change, because it's like more broad appeal now and it's reaching a wider audience.
Yeah, totally. From going back and thinking and remembering just from that standpoint, kind of what you formatted. And then, as I've said to you many times, like, whoa, that was, I'm not in the business. I'm not a, technical guy. I'm a podcast host. Right. And, but at the same time, when I listened to the episodes, they were interesting. And I think that just showcases kind of, what your brand does and is, and allows more people to understand that, because you do share these empathetic stories. And, I love how you even go back and you talk to your clients and start at the beginning in childhood. And is that something you found that just makes the show, when you really dig deep into each person, makes the show more compelling and interesting?
Yeah, and I actually think it puts the guests at ease too, right? Like they feel like this is a story about me, and everybody likes to share their story, right? Even engineers. And I started with a really easy, comfortable question people are, happy to talk about. They know the show's going to be much more fun and interesting, and it's not going to be all business talk. It's like what they learned as an entrepreneur that they can share. And entrepreneurs love telling their story.
They do.
Years in Silicon Valley, I've learned this. Agree. So I think, starting off with childhood questions, also, as we sort of progress the conversation, and when we go towards the end, so what did you learn, or what can you tell? What could you tell your younger self? They sort of see the connection, and the story sort of evolves, and it's a more compelling story than just, tell me about the product you're building and what challenges you had as an engineer, and why should engineers work for you?
Right. I love that. And I love that question about what would you, especially, hosting my own podcast with entrepreneurs, that's a great question. Just what would you tell your younger self? And especially a lot of people who are listening in your industry, who are seeing all these successful people and who might be starting out, might just be, starting to, work in the industry. I'm sure they appreciate those types of questions. And to me, that's why you come back. Like you said, you're not, it's presented by Velo 3D, right? This is laser focused, and it's incredible because it showcases thought leadership and innovation and what you're doing. But at the end of the day, you're really telling someone's story. And like you said, it seems like most importantly, kind of that human interest part of it has really catapulted this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
And what would you say, just in terms of, your company, your brand, you know, for companies, and we work with companies from, Ford, automotive, insurance, technology. But what would you say, just most importantly, if you were to give a tip, because you have a very successful show, if you were to give some tips about what's really the important part of formatting the show and then following through just, is it, like you said, making changes on the fly, but from the start? Sorry, I'm the worst podcast. You're supposed to ask one question and
I'm like,
that's it.
I need so much from you. Like, okay, you gotta talk more and ask a question.
I know. So I'm supposed to be interviewing you. So in any case, but what would you say in terms of tips that, I'm thinking I have a tech company and, I want to start a podcast. Are there any tips you would give to those folks, just in terms of, thinking about it, what you would think about it, and how you would plan?
Okay, so first tip I would say is really have a clear vision. And it's okay to pivot, like I said, right? But have a clear vision of what this show is, its objective is. Is it sales? Is it marketing? Is it thought leadership? Is it awareness? Is it brand building? Have a clear vision. And then, like, once you have that clear vision, what is the story you want to tell? So we're really clear on that. We want to sort of tell inspiring stories with leaders that are changing the world. We say that in every podcast during our intro and outro. And when we write about it and when we're pitching to guests, that's what we write. So really have a clear idea and a vision what you want to achieve with this. And then as you prepare, like when you're finding guests or trying to book guests, do they go back to that vision? We've turned, or we start with a list of guests that we want, and then we say, okay, this person really going to inspire? Are they leaders that are changing the world? And if we sometimes get somebody that we feel like is not, we would just, politely decline. So I think, you got to follow through that aim and that vision of your podcast from the beginning to the end. And then when you're sort of preparing for that show, making sure that, you have a dialogue that is showing what they're doing, like, making sure that inspiration and that thought leadership and what they can teach other entrepreneurs is coming out in that conversation.
Yeah. And when you even think about it, do you get people within your own company saying, hey, I love this podcast, it's great? Because I would imagine that, just in terms of retention and being able to be out there and say, hey, we are thought leaders. Does that happen? Do you hear those comments?
Yeah, I have one person on the team who has probably listened to every single episode and gives me feedback at the end, which I love, right?
Oh, wow.
Actually identified guests I've known before because of how comfortable we are on the show, right? So it is really interesting to see. And I've had somebody tell me that we've never met in person on the company. They feel like they've known me because of the podcast. So it is something that is also helping internal folk understand what we're doing and hearing the voice of the customer and being inspired by our customer base. And so that also resonates. And then they share it, right? They share it with their customers. Like some of the aerospace ones that we do, you see all over LinkedIn from our sales peeps, right? They're just putting it on saying, here's an excellent interview with Max from Launcher, or here's, it's only 30 minutes. You can listen to it on your commute to the kitchen table or whatever, So it is inspiring internally, and it's helping build our brand internally and helping people understand the voice of the customer and also show non-technical folk, right, that the people that we're working with are really, truly changing the world.
Yeah, it really is true. And the people, and I love how, you put that time into it as a host, not at the beginning, because that's when I know you're a little bit more nervous. You probably put a lot more time into it. But as a host now who is comfortable and putting out an episode, every few weeks, or how much time is it? Because a lot of companies, are saying, hey, we want our CMO or chief communications or CEO host the podcast, but how much time are they going to have to dedicate to it? How have you been able to handle that? And is it a lot of time?
Like you said, it is a lot of time at the beginning, right? And it's time well invested. I will say that, right? I remember some of the better interviews is because I spent more time preparing. But it's not to say that if you're a more comfortable host, that you don't need to spend that time. But it was so new to me, right? So I did spend that time. But towards the end, I remember like 5 minutes before a show, I got to plug my camera in, I got to turn my light on.
Yeah.
Ready, let's go, right? So it's what you want to put into it, right? And I think, as you said, as you do show 4, show 5 towards show 12, it's like doing any other marketing job for me now.
Yeah.
But I will say, like, just prepare yourself, because I think they're the better interviews. You have more fun on air. And I also have a really helpful person on the team, head of content, Amir, who helps me with all the logistics and writes the blogs for me, all that kind of stuff. So if you have a good team around you, it's not that much of a heavy lift.
Yeah, and talk about that, because I know a lot of companies, a key factor is your tape. So when you're creating your podcast, you're obviously, it's an audio podcast, but you're taping it in video, and you're taping the thought leaders you're talking to. And in terms of being able to, the podcast to be this funnel of content, how do you look at that? Because this is content that you could use for things like LinkedIn and other sources, or even, I think, as you mentioned, your salespeople being like, hey, check this out. Like, has that been something that you've looked at and worked on in terms of the content you create?
Absolutely. We've seen this as a big content driver for us. So not just the show itself, like once it airs, but we will maybe post it 2 or 3 times in different formats. So the video, maybe just the audio, a recap. I'll post it from my LinkedIn. I put it on my Instagram. There's a little podcast section on my Instagram. We create those promo boxes that hopefully people have seen, and we use those. And then the sales team use that. Then Amir will write a follow-up blog, for every single episode about things I've learned, the conversation we had with a link to the podcast. And then we're now thinking about doing like a recap, right? Like sizzle reels, like with voice about some of the guests and some of the cool things that they've said involuntarily about Velo 3D, or just some of the challenges they've had with building their company, right? So we've got lots of content out of the podcast already, and we've just finished season 1, but thinking about all the content we're going to come out with now leading up to season 2. So it's definitely been a huge content driver for us.
Yeah, it's incredible when you see it, because from everything I've seen, and first off, I love your thumbnail art. And I actually have to ask you a question. How did you, I wasn't in those meetings, how did you originally come up with Laser Focus, the name?
I think it was a lot of brainstorming. And we just sort of thought about like what we do as a company and what our customers focus on. And also lasers, that's how we print, right? So, it was,
I'm not the smartest. I'm not an engineer that you're here talking to.
But that's exactly why we started this podcast, right? We have lasers that melt metal or powder, and it creates metal. So it was a combination of, us laser focused with our product, but also customers being focused on what they're trying to build. So, and that's how we came up with it.
Yeah, I love the name, and I love the artwork, and I love seeing the additional branded content and how you are using that, just in general. I want to ask you, in terms of the podcast itself, and for you jumping in, what have you found most rewarding to you personally for being a host from the company on the podcast?
I think personal growth, coming out of your comfort zone, and everybody should do that, right? You should have a career goal or anything in any person at any level to keep continuing to grow. And I think the other one is just having access to these thought leaders and entrepreneurs, right? Now I can email any one of those and ask them, anything. Do you want to come on our webinar? Right, I hosted a webinar. Can you come to an event? Can you speak at this? We do a case study, or thanks, just like I saw this, I thought you'd be interested, right? Like I have now these solid relationships with these influencers and decision makers and entrepreneurs from across so many cool industries, just for being, on the show for 45 minutes.
Yeah, it's incredible. First off, what I found is very few people turn down the opportunity to speak on a podcast, especially when you're dealing with a podcast like a corporate company podcast, where most people want to share their knowledge or be thought leaders within that space. And for you, and for the company, has it been just, not for you personally, it sounds great, but as a company, being able to get a client on, or potential client, and have those conversations, it seems like that's enabled you to better relationships, and actually, like you said, especially the way you do things, really personalize them. So has that really helped as a company, just having these folks on?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like they've said things that we haven't asked them to say, so that's endorsed fellow 3D. But also our relationship that we've asked them to come on the show, has strengthened our relationship, and they're so happy to tell their story, and yeah, it's definitely been a brand builder for fellow, but also a brand builder for them, and the together it's just been really really strong relationship, and then it just tells a better story when we sort of launch it, and then they're also happy to promote the podcast too, which I think is awesome. So it has strengthened things in different ways. Some of it obviously is hard to measure, but just having them on the show, I think they see that we value them as a customer.
Do you have any favorite moments from episodes or conversations, or was there any where you were kind of just, wow, that was pretty cool?
Right. Like satellites are like size of toasts, right? Learning something about that, right? Or talking to, I remember, can I mention the names, right?
Of course, of course.
From Elementum, like he has like 3 PhDs or something. I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be so hard conversation. But it was so easy and I learned so much, right? And then talking to Tess von Bessemer, who, invests in space companies. I remember thinking I can go to any dinner party now and say all these cool things, right? The first selfie was created on the moon, like,
Right.
so there's been really, I learned a lot having these conversations, and at first you hate listening to yourself. I remember we talked about this, right? Like
Yeah.
I think it took me about weeks to listen to my first episode, and then later I was like getting on the treadmill, like, oh, what's my next episode that I can listen to, right? And you got to do it to learn too, but also just to think like, oh my God, I had this conversation with this really amazing entrepreneur, and look what I've learned, like,
Yeah.
like you
I love the learning part. Like you said, you learn so much as the host, and your audience learns so much, and that's what makes a podcast interesting is, being entertaining, but educational, and especially when it's a corporate podcast. And I think some brands or folks, they're like, oh, how could 3D printing be exciting, or how can software, but it's, to me it seems like there's no boring subjects, just it's boring, and it's all how you present it.
find that story, right? Ours was clear. We want to inspire people through inspiring stories by people who are changing the world, right? Maybe not all companies can say that, but I'm sure there's an angle there or something that they can find, and then just find those people that can authentically tell that story.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. Has, in terms of now and with the podcast and moving forward, are there things now after season one and you look ahead that you definitively want to change? Because the podcast itself has been so inspiring, but do you pick up little things and then implement them along? I know you do it along the way, but have thought about.
Yeah, we do it along the way, definitely. And also how I ask questions, I've learned so much, and little things like giving this, the guest space. But like you just learn so much as you're doing it. But at the end, it's like, okay, maybe we should have had a more business person rather than a technical person on the show, right? Like it depends, right? Like, so I think for us, it's more of a business focused, even if they're a technical engineer, but they're the CEO, that's perfect, right? Like we don't want somebody that's right in the weeds because they can't sort of tell that inspiring story. And maybe eventually, but right now it's just, that's the story we want to tell by people who can talk really clear about the business benefits they're getting and the story that they've experienced being an entrepreneur, or breaking through these barriers of innovation and how they got there. So that's the biggest lesson we learned, I think, from the very early, like, okay, we need these people who can talk and media savvy, right? Because we want to share their story and promote their story, because it doesn't want to, we don't want to just do all the hard work, right? But savvy you can have a really good conversation with, who can get out of a sticky spot, who can carry a conversation, who just speak authentically and are used to it.
Yeah. And it seems like as you've grown as a host, you've been able to at least lead them a little bit better, make them feel comfortable, which is, a big part of being a good podcast host.
I think one of your producers taught me this, right? So at first I didn't want to talk about me, right? It was all about the guest. And like at the end of one show, I remember saying, oh my God, my husband is like a race car driver and he wanted me to ask this question or something. And he's like, why didn't you ask it?
Right.
He's like, that you're the host. People want to get to know you too, right? It's a two-way thing. So make sure that you're sort of bringing your, like you said, authentic self and your personality to the show. And then the guest will also feel that they can do the same, right? So I think that's a really good lesson. It's a two-way street. People want to get to know you as a host, and they'll tune in because they hopefully they like you, and then they also the guest will open up and be more authentic because they can feel comfortable telling their story too.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. And I think as a host, and as you've shown, like, people expect that they know now. And I'm sure people within your own company, which is a big company, are like, they know you now as a person, but before you may have only appeared on, a quick soundbite or whatever, or a quote in, a newspaper. And now it's like, oh, Renette, because as I've known you, you've been such a wonderful personality, and like, super optimistic, always friendly. Like, and I know in listening to your pod, that comes across. And like, for people to be like, hey, that's our CMO, like, that's got to be a great feeling.
Well, that's really nice to
say. You can admit it. I will, and I want to ask you, we're running out of time here, but last question that I have for you, from someone who went back and was thinking about this, and more so now that I know you actually, I love you had it in your, proposal when you were interviewing, is awesome. Because when we were talking a couple of years ago, branded podcasts were really just beginning. Now, as you've seen, and I've seen with our company, we have 70 plus shows in production. But what advice would you give? Because I know there's a lot of companies out there that are like, we should be doing this, but our content, then we have to get, a producer, or however we do it. Is there any advice you would give to those companies who are kind of sitting on the fence about either creating a podcast or maybe just, pushing it off?
I would say do it. Don't hesitate any longer, because your competitors are going to catch up, right? I think we were really early to the game in this. And one of the things that I wanted to do it for also is just, we want to say that we're like a world-class marketing team. We're not just doing boring old, landing pages and pages and stuff and hoping that, like, we want to show the world that we are different and we're better than our competitors, right? We have a brand, we invest in our sales and marketing. It means that we are investing in our products. So do it before your competitors do it, and get the talent on the show that you want to get before your competitors do. I think that's the biggest thing, right? Like, and it will give you so much more channels for content, even if it's the only content that you do, right? You'll have a live podcast, you'll have a recording that you can use, and you'll have the snippets from that podcast, and you can write a blog about that podcast. You can write an ebook about all the guests and their stories, right? So the potential is endless with a branded podcast.
It really is. I mean, that's obviously one of the reasons, and a lot of our companies we work with do it, because just from your one episode, you have so much opportunity for video clips, exactly, thought leadership clips from the people you're interviewing, stuff that you can use. It could formulate a whole content plan for a month. And a lot of the stuff, even, it tends to be, evergreen in what you're using. And, you brought up one point that I just think, before we close, is really relevant. And I say this, especially, a company like yours, who's a leader in the space, right? And one of those companies that's growing top. But, we'll do a podcast with a company that isn't as big, or not even doing as much as, let's say, another bigger company that should be the thought leaders. But what's incredible, like you said, is if you don't get out there and do it, that they're going to become the thought leaders in the space, right? And they're going to lose. I didn't hear it, but you're right. They're going to lose those interviews because, there's only so many. I went on this podcast. I'm going to get asked to go on this other one. So
yeah, exactly.
It's really interesting. But Renette, Always great to see you. Always great to hear. And you, of course, you have the perfect accent too, which is
another reason people told me I should do it.
well, the accent is amazing. And I was at a podcast conference yesterday, and they actually did say voice has some like 20% said they listen because of the voice. And in any case, obviously, there's a lot more to it. You have to be like you are, a great listener, a learner, someone who makes someone feel at ease. But I do love the voice, that I'm sure everyone else does. And I want to thank you again for working with us and creating a branded podcast and really just talking authentically today about what laser focus has meant for you personally and for your brand.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Renette.
Take care of it.